So Bill H5445 is legislation I introduced as a result of a conversation I had with a constituent. What this does is it asks or requests of DEM to introduce regulations that would allow individuals to harvest mushrooms for personal use or personal consumption from lands controlled by the DEM. As of right now, a person who wants to go hunt for mushrooms and bring them home and cook up a nice meal aren't allowed to do it on land controlled by the DEM. And this legislation just asks them to put together the regulations required to allow that to happen, again, for personal use only. And I'll take any questions if anybody has any.
Thank you, Representative. Any questions? Representative Ranglin Vassal.
Thank you. I had one question when I read this bill earlier. The line that talks about, let's see, to authorize any person to take mushrooms from any lands under the control of the director, providing such taking is for personal use only. It's a really simple question. What is the standard? Like, how do you know if it's personal or they need it for sale?
Well, part of the regulatory process would be limiting the number. So obviously, if someone's, I would make the assumption that if a person's out there doing it for a business, they would be collecting more than just, say, 3 or 4, or a pound restriction. That comes back to the regulatory process. So if DEM were to implement regulations, part of that would be probably a weight limit or a number limit associated with the collection. You know, whatever a reasonable amount would be for an individual would want to collect in order to consume personally. And then I believe that number would then dictate how that would be established.
So I have another question, Mr. Chairman.
Go right ahead, Representative.
Then maybe it would it make sense then to be explicit and to, I don't know a lot about mushrooms, except that I eat it. But just to specify, because what I think is maybe just for personal use may be different from what another person takes, it's relative. So
And I agree with that comment, which is why we enjoy the committee process, because that's what we want to do. We want to get the input. This legislation itself is actually just modeled off of what Massachusetts has either just recently done or is recently doing right now. So that's all I did. I took this from the constituent sent me the information in terms of the model legislation of Massachusetts and submitted it as it was. Again, I'm not necessarily a professional on mushroom collection. There's a lot of folks in my district, Burrillville, Gloucester, I believe. More than 1/3 of the land up there is actually controlled by DEM. So we've got a lot of folks. I was actually surprised, just, you know, now that I've noticed it, throwing through my Facebook feed, how many folks in my community actually go out and do this on a regular basis. And again, by no means am I an expert on the collection of mushrooms and the difference between, you know, what would be a commercial versus a personal use, which is why, you know, I necessarily agreed with the language to leave it broad to allow DEM to establish that, because, or I would, you know, I would go ahead and allow the committee to, you know, if you have recommendations, to go ahead and bring those forward.
Just some more mushrooms.
Any further questions for the Representative McEntee?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Have you seen the Have you seen the letter from DEM?
I have. I actually had a conversation with their legislative liaison. DEM follows the DEM's policies right now. They have a thing, what is it? The 7 principles of, someone in the audience might be able to help me with this. What is it? Leave no trace. So the concept behind that is that's the way they manage. There's the 7 principles that allow for the management of of public lands, and including that is there's a section in there that says that you're not supposed to tear down trees, cut down trees, branches, things like that, and there's some references to mushrooms and things like that. But I would argue that pretty much, was it Connecticut and Massachusetts are currently doing this now. Washington, Oregon, several states out west are also doing this. They also follow. My understanding is they also follow the 7 principles of leave no trace. So if these states have found it in their wisdom to say that this does abide by the leave no trace, well, then I'm going to say, you know, I'd like to believe that we could do the same.
Yeah, they also talk about some education and training I wonder if they're concerned about mushrooms that are unhealthy.
Well, that's the point behind, I called it, I think if you read, I actually got an article about this in the Projo, which kind of blew my mind. There's a line in there that pretty much says, if you're an idiot and come in here and do something you're not supposed to do, the state is not responsible for this. So the idiot clause
I'm not
doesn't
so
apply.
sure that's always the case, but I can see why they'd be concerned with that.
Yes.
But, obviously you can work with them, I would say.
And I agree, and like I said, that's why they did reach out to me, and we did have a, pretty long telephone conversation. They explained their concerns, and again, the committee process is the committee process. So I recommend recommendations from the committee, obviously not just from me, but from other people in the community.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Representative McLaughlin.
Yes, Rep, I'd like to commend you on your bill. It's, a great concept. I think Representative McAtee said it all. My only area of concern was if you get someone who has no knowledge of, mushrooms, goes in there. There are poisonous mushrooms, and if DEM's aware of it, and what precautions they would be taking in allowing this, people will come in and actually pick, or do they have measures, and would they implement measures in place to actually identify the different types of mushrooms?
Well, I think, again, that's why it gets back into again, I was pleasantly surprised by this. There's actually a lot of organizations out there in both Massachusetts, Rhode Island, across New England that do this on a regular basis. Okay. And part of that is education. And again, as this discussion is developed, just this thinking off the top of my head, I could see if DEM developed some sort of regulation. Part of that is being a member of one of these associations where you can say that you have, again, this is a recommendation off the top of my head, where you have received training on this type of thing. But again, at the same point, I'm not necessarily of the idea that I want to restrict your ability to do something to protect you. These are public lands, and while they're not necessarily there for us to do as we have in terms of tear up at will, this is considered a low impact, low impact activity on the public lands. And again, to the benefit to the constituency versus the detriment, obviously I introduced the legislation. I believe that it's more beneficial to our constituents to be able to enjoy the lands in a, what is no longer a traditional way, because at one point in time, that's what the lands were for. We harvest mushrooms, we ate them. I mean, the hunter-gatherers, that was part of what they did. And what we've gone to as a culture is started to go back to that in terms of that buy local, find local attitude. And this is just, again, in my mind, I saw this as an extension of that concept.
Great concept. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions for this witness? Thank you, Representative. Brian Mulcahy of Rhode Island DEM is neutral, but has concerns. Our next witness will be Robert Burke.
Good evening, and thank you. My name is Robert Burke. I'm a fourth-generation Rhode Islander, the owner of the Pot au Feu restaurant, and also the creator of the Independence Trail in Providence. I have 5 short arguments as to why I believe this bill should be adopted and made law in Rhode Island. The first is a consumer argument, and that is, being in the food business, we're acutely aware today of people's desire for farm-to-table, for locavore, and especially to be able to get lots of varieties, heirloom tomatoes, things like this that you see that are not generally available in the mainstream supermarket food chain. So this presents the opportunity for Rhode Islanders who go out and will find literally dozens of species that you've never seen, even in a store like Whole Foods, available to you on a short walk through the woods. So knowing now people who collect mushrooms and who do this as part of their tradition, I think it responds to the farm-to-table and locavore movement in a very realistic way. The second is environmental. The question comes up as to whether or not, if you go out into the woods and take mushrooms away, whether or not that results in a loss of mushrooms for future use or future generations. And I can tell you that the science is that mushrooms, apples are to apple trees as mushrooms are to the mycelium. The mycelium is one of the largest living organisms on Earth. It is beneath the ground. The mushrooms that come up are the fruit of the mycelium. And it does not affect the mycelium when you take the fruit away any more than when you go out to an orchard in autumn and pick apples from apple trees. So this does not result in a loss to the environment, and it does not affect the source of that fruit, the mycelium, any more than picking an apple causes the tree to die. It doesn't. It's a natural process. The fruit has to be shed by the organism. It has to detach from it. And if it's not done by someone foraging, it will happen naturally with the mushroom dying in a period of days or weeks anyway. The third argument I have is regulatory. This is not an onerous task for the DEM to take on. They already regulate everything from shellfishing, the digging of quahogs, the taking of striped bass. They have processes and licenses and qualifications for everybody to do this. We don't need to create a new regulatory process. We merely need to use the existing regulatory process of licensing for the foraging and collecting and fishing of different species and include the mushrooms in that. Second to last is a legal argument. And the legal argument has to do with something that goes back all the way to our 1843 Constitution and actually predates it, going back all the way to the King Charles Charter, which is on display in the first floor of this building and dates to 1663. Article 1, Section 1, Article 17 says the following, that the citizens of Rhode Island shall have the right to the gathering of seaweed, leaving the shore to swim in the sea, and passage along the shore, and they shall be secure in their rights to the use and enjoyment of the natural resources of the state with due regard for the preservation of their values. We are the only people in the United States of America who have the constitutionally guaranteed right to collect seaweed. All of the other people who live in America are deprived of this right, which is unique to Rhode Island. And the reason that this right exists is because back in the times of Roger Williams, in colonial times, seaweed was fertilizer. And they guaranteed the right to collect the seaweed so that it could be tilled into the gardens and farms, guaranteeing that we would have an abundance of food for our citizens. And that right to use the natural resources as a food source, as an aid to growing food and as a food source itself, goes all the way back to when we were ruled by the King of England. And I think that it's appropriate for this committee to vote for this because it is a continuation of a legal precedent that goes back and is one of the longest standing legal precedents and one of the most unique legal rights, the right to collect seaweed that exists in America today, and I dare say beyond in the world. And the last is, I always ask when I'm wondering how we should do things in Rhode Island, I like to say, what would Roger Williams do? And Roger left the Massachusetts Bay Colony in a blizzard. Some people think he was going out to get bread and milk. Other people were thinking that he was trying to escape the long arm of the British law. He spent months out in the wilderness, and he finally settled on the shores of what is now the Seekonk River in what is now Rumford, and he eventually came across the river to Founder's Rock and settled here. And what we do know is that Roger Williams was a man of the forests. He was a man of the sea. He was a man of the woodlands, and he did not have a stop and shop to shop at. And he foraged. He foraged and he hunted and he fished, and I believe that we are continuing in the tradition of Rhode Island's original forager, the first forager of Rhode Island, our founder, Roger Williams, when we affirm this right for the citizens of Rhode Island today to be able to go out into our forests. And I think it's also important that as we protect our environment to realize that people who see a value in our wilderness and in our forests and in our bay and shoreline are the first to stand up to protect it from any kind of degradation and any kind of incursion. So I think that this is not only going to create a class of people who will protect our environment, I do know that in many of the ethnicities that have come to Rhode Island and made it such a great melting pot state, whether it's the French, the Italians, their families go back for generations of collecting mushrooms. out in the woods, and I will hope that the committee would move this on and that it will be voted into law. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Burke. That was very informative. Any questions for Mr. Burke? Okay, thank you. Our next witness will be Stephen Mikulski.
Stephen Mikulski is actually the chef of Pot au Feu. He's cooking right now and asked me to deliver to you his written testimony. And he is Rhode Island's first approved wild mushroom expert under the Health Department law that does give certification today, and is also creating a process by which Rhode Islanders can have their mushrooms inspected and certified by an expert. So the Department of Health is already ahead of this and has already put in place procedures by which people can have their mushrooms checked. And I know that was a concern of some of the members here today. So thank you very much, and I'll hand it.
Thank you, Mr. Burke. We can give that to the clerk. That concludes the testimony for 5445.